Does that look good, Stefano?
Yep.
Can you see? Yes,
Right.
great. Yep. So thanks to the organisers for having me here, and thanks to Stefano for introducing me. So my paper is entitled The Gothic Executioner in Golden Age Mysteries. And in this paper, I'll explore a subset of Golden Age crime writing, which was haunted by the figure of the executioner. In interwar crime narratives, including Paul Lancaster's The Executioner's Axe, John Dixon Carr's The Plague Court Murders, published under the pseudonym Carter Dixon, and Eric Harding's Behold the Executioner. I really enjoy its 2 exclamation marks. Grisly murders are apparently committed by the ghost of an executioner from a previous era. I'm influenced in my work by Lizzie Seal, who is a historian and criminologist, and in her work Capital Punishment in 20th Century Britain, she describes a changing picture of consent for and opposition to the death penalty in 20th century culture, with a few flashpoints that were directly connected to the figure of the executioner. By the 20th century, the public's ability to witness and to know the death penalty had rapidly declined due to increased government restriction and secrecy around capital punishment, making the executioner and the condemned man alike the targets of intensified popular mystery and fascination. Volumes of executioners' memoirs were widely sold across the century. Newspaper coverage of the death penalty also often centred on the executioner as a celebrity figure. However, within this coverage, as the 20th century wore on and the impact of psychoanalysis began to be felt, the figure of the executioner became a more problematic figure from the point of view of the wider public in particular, with his violent work for the state suspected to arise from individual pathology. For example, Freud's follower Theodore Reich in The Unknown Murderer from 1932 offered very similar explanations for both psychological impulses to commit crime and for society's retributive impulse, making the actions of the murderer and the executioner, and even for Reich, who's a little extreme, even the judge, appear to be similar or equivalent. Reich had earlier professed on behalf of Freud in View on Capital Punishment from 1926 that psychoanalysis is, quote, an opponent of murder, whether committed by the individual as a crime or by the state in its retaliation, deliberately collapsing the distinction between the actions of the murderer and the executioner. Similarly, within psychoanalysis, there was also greater emphasis on the executioner's potential to be traumatized by his work. The importance of the Golden Age Gothic in the interwar period is also linked to the fact that this was a period in which the death penalty was quite intensely debated, with 1920s debates on the military death penalty eventually leading to the first full debate on civilian capital punishment in Parliament in 1929. This mode of reflection on the death penalty took place in a Gothic mode, I'll argue. My approach to Gothic crime fiction is influenced by Serafini and Ascari, as well as by Michel Miranda and Peter Garrett. In particular, recently, Serafini has examined, in relation to other novels by Dixon Carr, the way that, quote, interwar novels subversively hybridize with different literary forms, particularly the Gothic. I argue that all 3 of the interwar narratives that I highlight here today explore fears and fantasies around the usurpation of the role of the executioner and reflect on the nature of trauma and the psychology of killing. I will focus first on the earliest novel I've chosen to discuss, Paul Lancaster's 1928 The Executioner's Axe. In this novel, the victim, Rosalie Storm, is robbed and murdered during a fancy dress party she is hosting. Rosalie's body is also mutilated after death to allow the theft of further jewels. An executioner's axe is found in the room with Rosalie's body, and this clue points to the film actor Terry O'Neill, Rosalie's former fiancé, who had crashed her party in the costume of a medieval executioner. Lancaster's detective, Frank Lanning, has an instinct that O'Neill is innocent because of the extreme violence of the crime, but this is eventually proven wrong. In fact, the the crimes were committed by two culprits, O'Neill did accidentally murder Rosalie by grabbing her when she confronted him during a quarrel, but it's eventually proven that she actually died of shock and heart failure. Her body was then mutilated by a real jewel thief, Rosalie's estranged husband, Kerry Bellairs. O'Neill was kidnapped by Bellairs, who wanted to recover the other jewels that O'Neill stole, and he had very little knowledge of what was happening in the investigation during this time. So these are just the surface details of Lancaster's story, but it's important to recognise how a masked executioner dressed in red stalks throughout this narrative, a fearsome figure who is too obvious a murderer to be recognised as such. The last words of the novel, as well as its title, emphasise the overarching importance of the Gothic symbolism of the medieval executioner. The executioner's axe is indeed the central clue, as Lancaster's detective reflects. Quote, "I might have spotted the clue which pointed first and last to Terence O'Neill was the executioner's axe." For a Golden Age mystery, Lancaster dwells more than usual on the way that a murder investigation will naturally lead to the death penalty, with frequent and direct discussion of hanging throughout the story, reflecting a true narrative preoccupation with the death penalty. Examples of this frank discourse about hanging includes to set a trap to get him hanged for murder, to risk being hanged by the neck, one can't let a man swing, and these kind of examples are peppered across the text. This inability to imagine a less violent outcome to a murder investigation leads to O'Neill's eventual suicide, even though the chief constable reflects very belatedly that, quote, "It's a pity, for it wouldn't have been a hanging matter. It would have been manslaughter," he implies. Well, in contrast to the next two narratives I'll discuss, characters in Lancaster's novel do not quite believe, except in the first shock of the crime, that the costume party has literally been haunted by a ghost, by the ghost of medieval headsman, no less. However, the way that O'Neill, as an actor, takes on this role and invokes this historical violence leads to both Rosalie's death and his own. Similarly, while the occult and Gothic aspects latent in Lancaster's The Executioner's Act will be developed more in the other two stories that I'll talk about, the robbery motive explored here will form a consistent thread as historical and supernatural themes are used by Golden Age writers and their criminals to distract us from earthly incentives to murder in the interwar context. So, just moving on. The fear in the Plague Court murders, which I'll now discuss, is located in the eponymous house, the London home of the Halliday family, which had been abandoned after appearing to be haunted by the 17th century executioner Louis Plage. The novel combines the Golden Age locked room mystery with the ghost story genre, as it opens by Dean Halliday asking the narrator, Ken Blake, to, quote, "spend the night in a haunted house." Halliday wants Blake to witness an attempted exorcism, but that night a murder will be committed instead. The victim is Roger Darworth, a psychoanalyst, psychic researcher, and exorcist, but also, as we will learn by the end, a social climber, a fraudster, a bigamist, and a murderer. Darworth is killed while inside the stone shed that the executioner supposedly haunts, to which no one else has access, and additionally no footsteps are visible in the mud outside the door. While Darworth is a fake, Carr proves that the painful history of capital punishment surrounding Plague Court is genuine, introducing fictional archival letters into the narrative for the detective and reader to assess. These letters reflect on how the house was cursed after the cruel executioner Plage, the brother of the steward of the house, died of the plague on the premises and was secretly buried in the grounds. Darworth's murder, committed during the attempted exorcism, uses the very dagger Plage had used to draw and quarter those he executed, which had previously been stolen from the Museum of Old London. The detail of these archival documents and the museum exhibition reflect the way cultural memory of a public death penalty was preserved in the 1930s, affecting people's view of the punishment in their own day. Still, as in Lancaster's novel, the most powerful manifestation of this memory is in the ghostly executioner who haunts the narrative. In fact, Darwin's staged exorcism had been turned against him in the story. He planned to draw out the violent history of the house and steal Halliday's wealthy fiancée through the glamour of the exorcism. His plot extended to stealing the knife from the museum and planning to be superficially hurt by it. But in fact, his true wife, Glenda, who had been posing as his child medium, seized control of the plot in order to kill her husband. Although Darwin remains inside the locked room throughout, and Glenda did not enter the space, she had a past career as a circus performer, how unlikely, and she was then able to climb the walls surrounding the courtyard and shoot him through the roof with implausibly dissolving bullets. I'll address the kind of unlikeliness of all this in a moment. Glenda believed that her husband Darwin would murder her and replace her, just as they had killed his previous wife, and she wished to inherit the proceeds of their different frauds and scams. The traces of a human presence and the executioner's knife found by the body would be enough to make it look like, quote, a ghost murder, particularly when Glenda's accomplice was one of the investigating police officers. So as you'll gather from the intricacy of my summary of the solution to Carr's mystery, in this narrative, the ghost of the executioner is exorcised only with very great difficulty by a laborious, rational explanation provided by the detective. As Sayers wisely puts it in her review of the novel, quote, like all sealed chamber mysteries, this one has a solution that takes a great deal of swallowing and demands a good deal of long-winded explanation at the end. That is the drawback of all plots of this type. We must add to the difficulties of the locked room mystery the challenges of dispelling the supernatural elements of the plot, as we might, after all, be more convinced by the executioner's ghost than by our detective's explanation. In Behold the Executioner, my last text, the main detective figure, John Tarleton, a businessman who has suffered a nervous breakdown, has travelled to Malway village to recuperate. Tarleton dreams presciently of an executioner's axe, the key symbol of the novel, his first night in the village, quote, a heavy-bladed axe, and the edge was sticky and red. The local vicar explains to Tarleton that his dream and his bad feelings about the village are not sourced in his illness, but rather reflect the violent history of the ruling family the village is named after, the quote, Mad Malloways. The lord of the manor, Guy Malloway, had ordered the unjust execution of a defiant village girl and executed her himself when his husband refused to do so. And you might hear the echoes of Conan Doyle's Hound of the Baskervilles, which Harding was definitely ripping off. Guy Malloway's identification with the executioner means that all his family will be cursed to wield the axe, in short, to become murderers. In Harding's narrative, 5 brutal murders are swiftly committed with the cursed axe. These crimes at first appear to be supernatural, and I found the story genuinely quite scary when I first read it, but maybe I'm a weakling, I'm not sure. So yeah, the crimes at first appear to be supernatural, but are in fact the product of a powerful identification with the Malloway legend and the figure of the executioner. These crimes are, quote, either the work of a maniac or a very clever criminal. We quickly learn that the culprit, the local policeman, Constable Jowett, begins his crime spree to hide sophisticated art theft from Malloway Manor. At the end of the narrative, the supernatural, historical, and psychological symbolism of the Malloway axe is brought under control as it is converted into merely Exhibit B in a murder trial. As in Carr's novel, a culprit who combines the murderer, the executioner, and the policeman would be unsettling for its Golden Age readership. Still, despite similarities both superficial and deep with Carr's tone and subject matter, Harding's novel was generally less positively received. For Maurice Richardson, the plot is, quote, exciting, but also, quote, among the sort of books one finds in a furnished house in Station Road. He also includes an arch reference to Ye Olde Headsman's axe, and thereby signals the way that the trope of the executioner's ghost had already become cliched. So to conclude, in this paper, drawing on the context of public fascination with the executioner in the Golden Age, sparked by a specific crisis in capital punishment policy during the interwar period, I've highlighted how these texts diagnose the death penalty's transcendent but appalling function, through a focus on the figure of the otherworldly executioner. Culprits in these narratives are often figures of the law, including policemen and judges, or theatrical figures like actors and performers who highlight the excessive, spectacular quality of the violence within justice and its power to act on imagination. These authors express in different ways an anxiety about the practice of capital punishment, as well as highlighting the way that Golden Age novels generate sensational psychological force for their crime narratives through the aura of violence surrounding the history of the death penalty.